This is a graphic that has a lot of gradient effects, and let's say I want to come in here and change the colors. So maybe we'll focus on this gradient here, the white to light gray. First I need to locate in the Photoshop file what this actually is. So one thing you can do is you can look through the different shapes and see if you find one that matches. You can also turn layers on and off to try to match them. Now in this case I can see that this sort of rectangular area could match up with this layer. Let's go ahead and turn that off and see what happens. I'll click the eye icon and it does disappear, so I know that that's the right shape. Now if I take a look at the shape, it's a shape layer. If I want, I can change the background color. Let's go ahead and do that. If I double click on the color patch, I can now change the color to something else. Let's make it a light yellow. And you'll notice that nothing happened. It still looks gray to white. That is what clues me in to the fact that there is probably a layer effect applied to this layer. And indeed you can see the F icon, which signifies that there is a layer effect applied. So I'll click the arrow to expand it, and I can see that there's a gradient overlay going over this layer. Let's double click on this effect and look at the settings. So the gradient overlay layer style basically takes a gradient that you define and puts it over the layer, and it covers whatever the original color or colors were on the layer. So if I click on this patch, that allows me to bring up the gradient editor, and now I can change the gradient. So if I want, I can change my white to be more of a yellow color, and I can also change this gray. And I think what I'll do is I'll pick this yellow color and then pick a darker shade of it. Now if I click OK, and OK again, you can see that my gradient has changed. Now there are a few other things that you can do with a gradient overlay. You can choose to have less opaque gradient. Just to demonstrate that, let me change the background color to be more obvious. And I'll go back into the gradient editor by clicking on the double clicking on the layer style name, and I'm going to lower the opacity. And you can see that the background color does show through when you do that. Another thing you can do is you can actually have a gradient effect that is partially transparent. So let me double click on this. Now these bottom color patches are what set the colors of the gradient. You can have multiple color gradients, so I could click in here to add another color patch and then double click on this to have a different color in there. And I can choose kind of where that different color shows up on the gradient by dragging it around. Now the upper part controls the opacity levels. So if I double click on here, you can see that I can set the opacity level. Let me bring that down. And you can see that that allows the gradient to become more transparent and allows whatever is in the background to show through. So those are just some things that you can do with the gradient editor. A lot of times you'll find that if there's a shape layer, it will have a gradient effect applied to it. Now sometimes you will find that there are raster layers with an effect applied to it. And in that case, here's one example. Let me hide all of this so you can see this more easily. And here I have a few things happening. I have a bottom layer. Let me turn it off. So that's kind of this whole rectangle here. You can see how it appears when I show it again. And that has a gradient applied to it. So let's take a look at this gradient. Now this gradient is a basic black to white gradient, but it doesn't show up as black to white, and the reason why is because the blend mode has been changed to multiply. What this does is this allows the darker parts of the gradient to darken the colors. The white and lighter parts don't have any effect on the color underneath. Let me change this back to normal, and you can see that the gradient will change and make this 100%. You can see that it goes from black to white. Now, it was lowered, and let's bring this back to multiply. You can kind of just see that color change slightly. That's just one effect that you can use. This also has a pattern overlay for the diagonal lines. And the reason why there's this extra layer on top is so that the pattern lines will fade. So if I turn this off, you can see that the pattern lines go all the way down. So let me turn that back on, and then turn these off so you can kind of see this layer by itself. So right now we're just looking at layer 3. You can see that it starts with this purple and fades to a transparent area. Now that's a raster layer with a gradient, created with a gradient tool. So if you want to change this gradient, there's a few things you can do. You can make a new layer and put a new gradient on top of it. So let me go ahead and do that. You want to pick your color for the gradient. Let's just keep it yellow for now. And then you want to select the gradient tool, which might be hidden behind the paint bucket tool. And once you have that selected, you can go up here and make sure that you have the foreground to transparent option selected. Once you do that, you can simply click where you want the gradient to start, hold the shift key down, and that will keep the gradient to a straight line. And then you drag upwards and you release when you want the gradient to end. So you can see how that gradient was created. Now if you want to keep the same exact gradient effect that was there, what you can do is you can lock the layer, and that will allow only the existing pixels to be edited. So at this point I can actually choose one of my other tools. For example, I can choose a brush tool, and I can just simply paint over the gradient layer, and that will allow only the pixels that are already colored to be colored in. Now a quicker way of doing that is to actually use the gradient tool, and instead of starting from the bottom and dragging up, I'm going to start near the top. So in essence I'm filling this area with a kind of solid color, but it's only filling in the actual pixels that are selected. So if you have a existing raster gradient that goes to transparent, that's one way that you can keep the same effect but change the color. Okay, let me show you something else you can do. I'm going to make a new layer and then select the rectangular marquee tool and just make a rectangle. So what the marquee tool is, it limits edits to this area inside the dotted line. Now I will make sure that I have a foreground and background color selected, and then I'll select the gradient tool, and instead of foreground to transparent, I'm going to pick foreground to background right here. And once I do that, I'll click here, move it upwards, and notice when I hold down the shift key, that line is going to become vertical, and I'll release at the top. And what that does is that fills the rectangular area with a gradient. And so that's one way that you can create kind of rectangular areas really easily with the gradient tool. These are raster layers, they aren't vector shape layers. So the reason why I usually use vector shape layers is because they're easier to edit and change the shapes of them.